All right, welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you all for coming. My name is Stan Voiger. I'll be moderating our conversation later. Today I am very happy to welcome Yascha Mounk, sitting right here. Yascha will open the event with about 20 minutes of remarks about his book, The People versus Democracy. After that, we will sit down. Jonah and Norm will attack Yascha, who will then defend himself. After that, we will have a little bit of conversation between ourselves, and then we'll open it up to the audience for short, insightful questions that end with a question mark. With that, Yascha, you want to go ahead? Watch out here, don't fall.
Thank you, Stan. The last time I was here, I was sitting in one of these chairs, and strange Dutch politicians were being projected behind me for a Dutch election event. So I feel on more firm ground today. When I was growing up, my parents grew up in socialism in Poland, and when I grew up, they would always tell these jokes around the kitchen table that I didn't really understand, because my knowledge of minor Polish political figures from the 1960s is limited, and because I didn't really quite connect with their sort of sense of political powerlessness. But over the last couple of years, I've been thinking back to a few of the jokes I grew up with. I'm going to share one with you. No worries, it's very straightforward to follow. A man walks home from work late at night. He's nearly at home when he sees a guy to his right, completely drunk, doubled up over the gutter, throwing up. And as soon as he sees the man, he puts on a big, broad smile. He walks over to him. He puts his hand on his shoulder, and he says, "I completely agree with your political analysis, comrade." As you can imagine, that's how I've been feeling for the last couple of years. And in the People versus Democracy, I try to make sense of all of the reasons there are to do what that man did. I try to make sense of this political moment and its stakes, and how to actually defend some of our most basic values. So when I was growing up, my assumption was, and it's an assumption that I later learned at university most political scientists shared, and most journalists shared, most ordinary citizens shared, that there are some countries in which we can take the persistence of democracy for granted. In the last year or two, democracy in Kenya has been challenged in ways that are worrying and tragic, but that wouldn't have surprised political scientists, because the country didn't have deeply established democratic norms and it's relatively poor. We see the resurgence of authoritarian powers and less and less hope that a country like China might transition to democracy. That too wouldn't necessarily have surprised political scientists who knew that some authoritarian regimes had real longevity. But when you looked at the universe of countries where the government had already changed hands for free and fair elections a couple of times, and where you had a GDP per capita of more than about $14,000 in today's terms, you could supposedly assume that it was safe, that it would persist for a long time. Well, I think that consensus has been challenged in the last year by political events. We now see that in countries like Hungary, which had supposedly consolidated, liberal democracy is really on the ropes. And I would argue that even in countries like the United States, like Germany, like different parts of Europe, democracy is increasingly threatened by a resurgent class of populists who are challenging basic democratic rules and norms. So why did political scientists think that democracy was consolidated, but democracy had become the only game in town? Well, they thought that countries were safe when an overwhelming majority of people actually gave importance to living in a democracy, agreed with its ideals, when very few people were open to authoritarian alternatives to democracy, and when most politicians and political parties had a deep consensus around basic rules of the game. As I argue in the book, that's no longer necessarily the case. In the United States, over 2/3 of older Americans born in the 1930s and 1940s give great importance to democracy, but less than 1/3 of younger Americans born since 1980 do. 20 years ago, 1 in 16 Americans said that army rule was a good system of government. Now it's 1 in 6 Americans. Among young and affluent Americans, it's actually gone up from 6 to 35% over the course of 20 years. There are similar figures for a lot of European countries. In Germany, 16% believed that a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament and elections was a good thing 20 years ago. Now it's 33%. In France and the United Kingdom, it has doubled from 25 to 50%. So all of those are striking facts which are concerning. But, it's difficult to interpret these opinion polls, and I wouldn't put too much weight on them. It's unclear what to make of the willingness of citizens to say these worrying things. But it is backed up by their actual voting behavior. You see the rise of populist parties that don't just have disagreements over economic policy, disagreements over immigration, but rather who challenge whether or not they should accept the outcome of democratic elections, who claim that the free press is illegitimate, who want to undermine the independence of the judiciary and other institutions in a whole vast swath of countries. In the year 2000, the average vote share for a populist party in Europe was 8%. Today it's 25%. If you remember Winston Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech, where he said an Iron Curtain was descending across Central Europe from Stettin all the way to the south. Well, today you can actually drive from Stettin in the Baltic Sea all the way even further south than Churchill talked about to Athens in the Aegean and never leave a country ruled by populists. So populism is no longer just an insurgent force, it's becoming in many ways a dominant political regime form. In the book, I make a couple of contributions to help us understand this. One of them is conceptual. It's to remind us of the nature of our political system and how it can help us understand what's been going on in the world. The core aspiration of our political system, I argue, is to guarantee two things at once: individual liberty and collective self-rule. So individual liberty is the liberal element of liberal democracy. And when I say liberal today, I don't mean liberal and conservative, and I mean something to which George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan should be as much committed, and were, I think, as much committed as Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. So what does that consist in? It consists in the freedom that each of us has to say what they want to say or abstain from saying what we don't want to say, to worship in the ways we want to worship and abstain from worshipping in ways that we don't want to worship, to lead a life in which we alone determine what we do. And in order to sustain our ability to do that, we need a set of institutions, including the rule of law, the separation of powers, and perhaps most importantly, individual and certain forms of minority rights. Once you've defined liberalism that way, you can define democracy in a much more straightforward way than a lot of people want to do. A lot of people want to squeeze everything that's nice in the world into the term democracy. In fact, there's a New York Times article today arguing for just that. And I think that's a mistake. That makes it harder for us to think about the world. So in my mind, democracy is just the rule of the demos, the rule of the people, which means that in order for a country to be democratic, it has to have a set of binding electoral institutions that actually effectively translate popular views into public policies. My fear is that these two things, these two elements of our political system, have increasingly come to drift apart. So that for a long time, we've had a system that I would call rights without democracy, or undemocratic liberalism, not the cleanest term I know, in which we do a reasonably good job at protecting the rule of law and the separation of powers. We do a pretty good job of protecting individual minority rights, well, there's some footnotes there, but we do quite poorly at actually translating popular views into public policies. One reason for that is that our elected legislators aren't always very good at actually implementing the preferences of their constituents, of the people who voted for them, because of the huge role that money plays in our politics, because of a revolving door between lobbyists and legislators, because of the fact that a lot of members of the political class have lost touch with ordinary citizens. If you have to spend, as a lot of congressmen do, about 50% of the time fundraising, You don't have to go against your principle by the time you vote on a particular bill on the House of Congress. You have already come to share the views of the people who send you campaign contributions at the end of the month. The good news here is that there's a lot we can do to fix that element of undemocratic liberalism. It's hard to reform campaign finance and so on and so forth, but it's easy to think about how you would do it in principle. I think there's a deeper conceptual dilemma in another aspect of rights without democracy. And that's that a lot of decisions have been taken out of democratic contestation altogether. So the problem is not just that Congress is not as responsive to ordinary people as it should be, it's also that Congress doesn't decide about a lot of important things. Because of the rise of judicial review and the huge importance of the Supreme Court in the United States, because of the rise of central banks that are more independent and make more important decisions than they used to a few decades ago, because of the rise of independent agencies like, say, the EPA or the Consumer Protection Bureau in the United States, or the European Union, and particularly the European Commission in the European Union, because of international trade treaties, international organizations. If you take all of those things together, a lot of the most important binding rules in our society aren't made by legislators, they're made by technocratic and expert-led institutions. And that poses a much deeper democratic or technocratic dilemma, because the two glib answers to this don't work. Some people want to deny the existence or the importance of these institutions and say there's no problem here. But if we want democracy, if we want to actually give people the sense that their voice counts, then these institutions undermine that. The other answer is to say, well, we should just abolish these institutions and get rid of them and return power to the people and that'll solve everything. But that is also overly glib, because we need experts to make regulations if we want power plants to remain safe. You're not going to have ordinary people voting on what exactly the regulation is that is needed there. That doesn't work in practice. And if we want to deal with big challenges like, say, climate change, we need cooperation at a big international scale. We need 193 countries around the world to come together and actually agree on a course of action. But no matter how you're going to do that, it's going to be very difficult for people in this room to feel like we actually have a voice in what happens. So I think that dilemma is quite deep, and it has been under-theorized. Now, the second set of contributions I make is to try and think about the other side of this, which I call illiberal democracy. In part as a result of a sense that they no longer really have a voice, people are saying, you know what, let's get rid of some of the ways we currently do things and really speak for the people. And that's led normally by populists. Let me say a couple of words about what I mean by a populist, because there's some confusion about that. And it's not immediately obvious what somebody like, say, Donald Trump has in common with Recep Erdogan in Turkey, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Marine Le Pen in France, or Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. As you may have noticed, our president is not overly fond of Muslims. Well, Recep Erdogan, the president of Turkey, doesn't appear to be overly fond of anybody who's not a Muslim. So we don't have that in common. There are some populists who are very right-wing economically, who want to abolish parts of the welfare state and decrease government regulation and so on. There's others, like Hugo Chavez, who are very left-wing economically, who want to attack businesses and expand the welfare state. So we don't have that in common. So why even talk about populists? Well, I think they have an important set of things in common, which is the claim that politics is at its heart pretty simple, that the only reason why we have political problems is the corruption and the self-servingness of the political elite, and that the only thing we need to fix it is a candidate or a party that really embodies the people, that can really channel common sense politically, and that movement alone is politically legitimate. It is that claim to exclusive legitimacy which lies at the heart of populism. So what do populists say? They say, just, I'm going to fix it. Trust me. I am the voice of the people. An enemy who disagrees with me is illegitimate. Now, once they get into power, they tend to say things like, who knew that things could be so complicated? Who knew that healthcare was so complicated? Well, I think there's a few people in this building who could have pointed that out. Who knew, I fear the president is going to say in a few weeks or months, that negotiating with Kim Jong-un might turn out to be so complicated. But of course, they don't want to admit that they've made false promises which were unrealistic from the start, and so they start to cast blame. They start to attack the press for supposedly spreading fake news. They start to attack independent institutions like the FBI or the Department of Justice for being enemies of the people. They start to claim that the opposition are traitors if they don't stand up for a standing ovation. And this is a pattern that we see in many countries, not just the United States. Now, the way to understand this, I think, is this illiberal democracy. Take the case of Switzerland, where there was a referendum about the building of minarets about 8 years ago. 62% of the population there voted to outlaw the tower adjacent to mosques, which is traditionally used for cultural prayer. As a result, the Swiss constitution now reads, and I quote, "There's freedom of religion in Switzerland. The building of minarets is forbidden." Doesn't make much sense. And a lot of people in Switzerland, in the United States, in Europe call it undemocratic, which is a mistake. 62% of people voted for this. It's clearly democratic. What it is illiberal in ways that I personally find intolerable. Right? But we have to be clear about what the nature of this political change is. Now, what is true is that once you go further and further with democracy without rights, it starts to cannibalize itself. Once you're at the point where Hungary under Viktor Orban is this Sunday, when they have elections, where the judiciary has been made blind, where state television stations are propaganda outlets, where private television stations have been forced to be sold to allies of the government, where the Electoral Commission is so partisan that it investigates all of the opposition party for supposed campaign infractions and levies huge fines on them, while declining to investigate the party of the ruling prime minister, Fidesz, in the same manner. You have elections that might in certain ways be free, but that are certainly no longer fair. So you get to a point where it's impossible to oust the democratically elected prime minister or president of a country by democratic means. And that is the danger of illiberal democracy, that it eventually starts to devolve into dictatorship. All right. Why is all of this happening now? How do we get to this stage? Why are populists rising all across Central Europe and in parts of Western Europe and North America as well? Why now? Well, if you'll indulge me, I will try to answer that question by telling you the story of a chicken. Now, it's the kind of chicken that we'd all like to eat for dinner around here, which is to say that it's organic and free range and all of those things. But all the other animals on the farm warn it and say, be careful, the farmer only seems nice. One day he's going to come and kill you. The chicken says, what are you talking about? He's nice to me, he feeds me every day, he mutters some encouraging words. Why would he suddenly act so differently? Well, Bertrand Russell, whom I stole the story from, points out in his nice wry writ that eventually the farmer does come to wring the chicken's neck, showing that more sophisticated views as to the uniformity of causation would have been to the chicken's benefit. What does he mean by that? Well, what he means by that is that there are scope conditions to how things work in the social world. As long as the chicken was too thin to fetch a good price on the market, the farmer had a good reason to keep feeding it. Once it was fat enough that it would fetch a good price, he had a reason to kill it. So what we have to ask is the question about the scope condition of liberal democratic stability. What was true for the 50, 60 years in which a large number of democracies around the world were astoundingly stable, that is no longer true now. And in my book, I suggest that there's 3 big sets of factors there. The first is a stagnation of living standards for ordinary citizens. From 1945 to 1960, the living standard of the average American doubled. From 1960 to 1985, it doubled again. Since 1985, it's essentially been flat. That really changes how people think about politics. We never used to think that people gathered in rooms like these in Washington, D.C. are paragons of moral virtue. We never used to think that politicians are the most trustworthy individuals in the United States. But they gave them the benefit of a doubt. They said, you know what, I'm twice as rich as my parents were, my kids are going to be twice as rich as me. In the end, they seem to be sticking to their end of the deal. Now they're saying, you know what, I've worked hard all of my life, I don't have much to show for it. My kids are going to be worse off than me, probably. Am I allowed to swear here, Stan?
Yeah.
I'll take that as how about if I go for a mild swear? I think everybody now is going to be disappointed. Now they say, look, you know, I worked hard all my life and have much to show for it. My kids are going to be worse off than me. Let's throw some shit against the wall and see what sticks. How bad could things get? That was fine, thank you. Otherwise we'd have to go back and I'd have to revise it. It's difficult. So, you know, that sense of baseline disappointment is really important. And though it's true that it's not necessarily the case that poorer people voted for Donald Trump in greater number than richer people, there's a very clear geography to populism, which you see not just in the United States, but in countries around the world. Donald Trump won 2/3 of American counties, but only a little over 1/3 of America's GDP. He did much better in parts of a country in which there is less recent economic investment, in which there's fewer high-skilled people, even in which the share of jobs that might be automated away in the coming decades is much higher. But the world is not monocausal. There's not just one cause for anything interesting that's going on. There's a number of them. And so the whole debate about whether it's economy or culture, in my mind, is silly because it's both of those things and they reinforce each other. So another important factor is that most democracies in the world were founded as mono-ethnic and monocultural countries, or countries at least that had a mono-ethnic, monocultural conception of themselves. If you go to Germany in 1960, Sweden in 1960, Italy in 1960, and you ask people who really belongs to your political community, the answer for most people there would have been obvious. Somebody who's descended ethnically from the same stock. I'm ethnically what is Swedish, and my compatriots are those who are also ethnically Swedish. Would have been a straightforward answer. Well, over the past 50 years, we've had a lot of immigration into these countries, and thankfully, that conception has started to shift in many ways. It started to shift legally. In Germany, for example, it was actually impossible to become a German citizen other than by either ethnic descent or marriage until the early 1990s. Now you can immigrate and become a citizen. And it started to change culturally in many ways as well. But it shouldn't really surprise us that there is some strong resistance against that. If you are not the richest guy in the country, you are not the most educated guy in the country, you perhaps didn't command the greatest social respect, it was very tempting to say, well, at least I'm Swedish rather than, Polish or Italian or, God forbid, Algerian. And it was really tempting to say, at least I'm a member of the majority rather than one of those immigrants here. Well, thankfully, one of those immigrants might now be that guy's boss. He might now be representing that guy in parliament. And that's real progress. But something has been taken away from him, which is a status, an unearned, but a status advantage over others. Now, the story in the United States is both similar and different. It is different in the sense that the United States have always been a multi-ethnic society, but it's similar in that it's always been a multi-ethnic society with a pretty strict racial and religious hierarchy. We've come a long way in overcoming that. And that's something we should remember and celebrate. There's no doubt in my mind that it's better to be a member of just about any ethnic, religious, or sexual minority in this country today than it would have been 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. Perhaps not 2 years ago, but certainly 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. But again, it shouldn't surprise us that some of the people who therefore have to give up on the unearned advantages that they used to have might rebel against that. Now here too there's a geographical element to where this drives people's support for populism. It's not necessarily in the most diverse parts of a country. It seems like an obvious point, but that's the objection that's always made on the economic side. right? If we applied the same logic of the economic objection, then we would have to think that whites in cities like Washington, D.C. or New York City should be especially likely to vote for populists. That's not the case. But what is often the case is that people in parts of a country that have rapid demographic change are voting for populists. People in districts like that of Stephen King, the representative from Iowa, who represents a county that was overwhelmingly white 10 or 15 years ago, and has actually seen quite a lot of growth of diversity in the last 10 or 20 years. So that it was once the case in that district that you basically virtually never have to deal with somebody who's quote-unquote not like you, and now on the day-to-day you do. That is the moment when you get the strongest rebellion against the prospect of an equal multi-ethnic society. Now the third thing is that if the economic developments explain a bottom-level, base-level lack of trust in the political system, and if this often takes the form of a cultural rebellion against an equal multi-ethnic society, the rise of social media makes it much easier for that political rebellion to take place. 25 years ago, you still had certain social gatekeepers, so that the owners of big television and radio stations and newspapers and publishing houses could determine what was part of acceptable opinion and what wasn't. Because of the rise of the internet and especially the rise of social media, that has gone away over the last 25 years. And in some cases, that's salutary. In some cases, that allows voices that were kept marginal to make their point and to make important points that persuade a lot of their fellow citizens. But coming on top of the frustrations that I've been talking about, it also makes it much easier for people who are full of hate or people who want to spread fake news to do real damage to our political system. So it's the cocktail, the mix between those three things that is quite dangerous. Now I've gone on for quite a long time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time right now talking about some of the solutions that I lay out in the book, but I hope that we'll have more of an opportunity to do that in the Q&A. I just want to say a couple of things about that. First of all, that we need to understand that populism cannot just have American causes. Otherwise, it wouldn't be happening all around the world. So we have to go beyond things that are just features of the American political system and understanding what's going on. And secondly, that populism has been rising in most parts of the world for a long time. So it's not just a matter of beating Donald Trump and containing the damage that, in my opinion, he's doing to American institutions. It is a matter of actually addressing some of the structural drivers that made Donald Trump possible in the first place. And since I'm talking about those three causes, that obviously means that my analysis has to do with addressing those three causes. I think we need an economic policy that can actually credibly promise to people that the future is going to be better than the present. And that involves giving them the feeling that, as the Brexiteers claimed in the United Kingdom, they can take back control. They have a sense that they, through their effort and achievement, can be in control of their individual fate, and that the nation in the age of globalization can actually stand tall and be in control of its fate. That requires an ideologically diverse and heterogeneous set of policies that run the gamut from making sure that rich individuals and corporations actually pay the taxes they owe rather than hiding their money in tax havens, all the way to making sure that we can actually build a lot of housing units, especially in big urban centers, so that people have access to economic opportunity rather than artificially limiting that. The second point is about the identity issue. I think we have a temptation on the right to double down on an exclusionary nationalism that says that some people will never be able to be full participants of our nation. And I think that is heinous. And without any footnote, without any reservation, we have to reject that, and we have to defend some of the people who are under very serious attack and suffer serious discrimination right now. And at the same time, we also need to resist the temptation that is prevalent on some parts of the left of saying, let's get rid of nationalism altogether. Let's leave it behind in the 20th century, which it so cruelly shaped. Or let's celebrate every form of identity at the subnational level, but not the collective one at the national level. Because nationalism can actually underpin the kinds of solidarity that we need in order to see each other as true compatriots across racial and ethnic and religious lines. And so what we need to fight for is an inclusive nationalism but emphasizes that there's something wonderful and special about forms of national belonging, but insists on the fact that people be included in that patriotism, irrespective of the color of their skin or the content of their religious beliefs. And finally, I think that we need to go back to doing what everybody from Plato to Aristotle and from Rousseau to the founding fathers emphasized, who thought about how to make a self-governing republic work. And that is to actually transmit our political values from one generation to the next. We barely teach civics in high schools at the moment. And at colleges and universities, we spend a lot of time talking about all of the shortcomings of our political system, as we should. But we spend very little time talking about what's good about our political system. We spend very little time explaining the dangers to our political system that populists have posed in countries like Venezuela and Turkey and Russia and Hungary. And we spend very little time repeating and emphasizing why, for all the flaws of our country and every country, it is better to be a citizen today of the United States, of Germany, of Sweden, even of the Netherlands than it is to be a citizen of Russia or China or Venezuela or Turkey or Russia. So the one hopeful thought that this lends to me is that unlike citizens of some of these countries, we still have the right and the freedom to fight for our political values. And for I think the nature of the challenge at the moment is very serious. If we make good use of that right, the end has not yet been determined. And we can actually come to the rescue of some of the things we most deeply believe and preserve the aspiration of our political system, which is that we can have both individual liberty and collective self-rule. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yascha. Indeed, last time Yascha was here, we did an event on the Dutch elections with a live stream. For those of you interested in electoral systems with successful populist parties, I'm happy to promote an event we're doing on Monday on the outcome of the Italian elections and the Italian economic outlook. Italy is one of the countries where sort of a range of flavors of populist parties has been pretty successful recently. So please do all join us for that as well. But now I want to give Norm the opportunity to respond to Yascha and to talk about these issues more broadly. After that, we'll go to John.
Thanks, Stan, and thanks for coming, Yascha. So today is day 440 of the Trump presidency, or as he says, longer than any other president. And just one small correction. He doesn't say who knew. He says nobody knew that there was a complicated healthcare system or that it could be so difficult. So it's very difficult with all the rich veins in this book and in what Yascha said to take 10 minutes. You have to pick out some strands. I'll take a couple of minutes just to talk about a couple of things in the book that I'm not as comfortable with or as much in agreement with. I do believe that the movement away from Congress to other entities has some problems with it. That's particularly true of the courts. And this is Congress passing the buck to the courts, and then when they don't like the outcome, pointing the fingers. And it has led to a whole series of more pernicious things. The more the courts have been involved in making policy, the more that political actors make sure that the judges who they nominate and confirm fit their political predispositions. And so we've moved away from judicial temperament or basic qualifications to making sure they're going to vote the way we want them to vote. And that's very dangerous, and it's led, I think, to a tribalism, certainly polarization in the courts, but also, over time, to a delegitimization there as well. I differ with you when it comes to independent central bankers. If you think about what America was like before we had an independent central bank, or even the regulatory agencies. But there, I think the issue is, And this gets to a broader theme that I want to pursue for a couple of minutes. What my late great friend and mentor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, wrote about and said, which is defining deviancy down. And that's, I think, as big a danger that we have now as anything else. It's as much the norms of behavior as anything. The independent regulatory agencies actually do have a significant number of constraints around them. And that's true of the executive branch as well. The Administrative Procedures Act, what you have to do before you can implement regulations, and the fact that an honest Congress can put serious checks in place if they believe that these regulatory agencies are acting outside their scope or in ways that don't fit the popular will. But we've lost that norm in Congress, and they don't follow, or they allow things to go on that never were allowed or allowable in the past. And I think that that's a larger point here, too, that you have rules, and you have laws, and you have norms. And what was one of the great strengths of the American political system for many, many decades was that those who were winning and losing in political battles still believed in a set of norms. Inside Congress, it's what the wonks would call the regular order. That was true of the way that you saw interrelationships among and across the branches. It was true of having, as you mentioned, the separation of powers, an independent Congress that believed deeply that its fundamental norm was to be an independent Congress. And we don't have that anymore. And as you go through the elements of autocratic rule, and this is populism, left and right, but it's also autocracy across the board. And all the things that you have talked about, the attacks on the free press, as Trump said, the enemy of the people, the kleptocracy that is a core part of what goes on, attacks on the judiciary, attacks on your political opponents. You would expect and hope that you'd have a Congress, whatever the partisan control of it, that would put some constraints around there. When you look at the kleptocracy, the president, his family members, his cabinet, and many others, and the fact that there has not been a single hearing, not one in the House or Senate, on any of these elements, tells you that that norm has basically been shattered or disappeared. I would mention one other element that involving the United States. All of the things that you've talked about, the uncertainty in economic terms, the stark division between the more cosmopolitan urban areas that have managed to thrive and cope with the vicissitudes of a global economy and technological change against those areas that have not. It was really striking. David Wasserman, a very good analyst of American elections, looked at counties in America that have a Cracker Barrel but no Whole Foods, and those that have a Whole Foods but no Cracker Barrel. And it predicts voting behavior in 2016 very powerfully. And of course, that just reinforces the point. And all these rapid changes and the rise of social media. But what also happened here, and this I take back to the late 1970s and forward, and I have long pointed at Newt Gingrich and others, a very direct attempt to tribalize politics and delegitimize government, partly as a political way of winning power. And for Newt, when he came in 1979, it was 24 consecutive years of Democratic hegemony in the House that stretched to 40. And the only way he saw of breaking through was to nationalize the process and get everybody so disgusted with politics in Washington that through a tribal sort of movement, you could win. And it worked in 1994, but we have seen the perturbations from that ever since. And that was reinforced, I believe, in tactics in the Obama years that worked like a charm in 2010 and 2014, but created an even greater sense of anger at the elites and at Washington that Trump took advantage of and that have continued on. Now, just in the last couple of minutes, I want to mention a couple of things that actually go beyond what you've written about that I find troubling looking ahead in the United States, even beyond what you've suggested. I will say I could agree with all of your 65 pages or so of things that ought to be done. the likelihood of most of them being done, as George W. Bush would say, slim to none, and Slim just left the building. But that doesn't mean we don't move in that direction. But if we're looking at having a popular rule where popular sentiment moves to representatives who reflect that popular sentiment, one statistic that I use a lot now, and that is a chilling one, is by 2040 or so, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states. And that means that 30% of Americans will elect 70 senators. And we know that that 30% are going to come from areas that are more rural, more homogeneous, less diverse, older, and as the country becomes more diverse itself, as it becomes more urbanized, as people move to areas where there are jobs and growth, we're going to see an increasing disconnect. And that could lead to an additional feeling of illegitimacy out in the country. And interestingly, the illegitimacy that is now felt by people in the rural areas who believe that their views are not reflected by elected officials may turn around and be reflected by the cosmopolitans who increasingly represent a substantial majority of the country but are not going to find representatives who believe what they believe. And that's true as well with the nature of the House, and that includes, of course, the fact that people increasingly are concentrated in urban areas, and that the big sort of people moving into places where they're surrounded by like-minded people beyond gerrymandering distorts the process. And then throw in an electoral college that from the time we first had popular votes meaning anything in 1824, all the way up through 1996, 44 elections, arguably one that clearly had a president elected without a majority of the popular vote. And in the 5 elections since, 2. And we know that as we move from these rural, small, sparsely populated states with population moving to the larger states, the distortions of the Electoral College are going to grow greater. And that means that we're going to have more and more elections where the popular vote does not reflect the outcome of the presidential contest. The first time in modern times it happened in 2000, which was as controversial and close and difficult as you could get, the overwhelming majority of Americans said, hey, you know, it had to be decided, and those are the rules, and it's like in tennis, it's not how many games you win, it's how many sets you win. By the second time, you had an increasing amount of grumbling over the outcome. By the third time or the fourth time, we may have people marching in the streets. And that goes way beyond all these questions of the kind of populism that emerges through economic dislocation, bad times that play on themselves, the tribal and social media that play into it. And it suggests that we have to think more seriously about a broader set of structural changes that were set in motion by the framers at a time when the ratio between the smallest state and the largest state was about 12 to 1, and now it's 70 to 1.
Well, the good news for you is that those 30 states will have 60 senators, but they'll only have 60 House members.
70 senators.
70 senators, but they'll only have 70 House members.
No, they will have more
too.
because every state gets at least one House member, and when you begin to allocate, you're going to get not equal population in each of them either, so it's worse.
Yeah. Jeremy, you want to go?
Well, as someone who's been giving a speech for the last 10 years titled, Cheer Up, the Worst is Yet to Come, I take you at your word that it'll be worse. I find myself agreeing with a remarkable amount of Yascha's argument in terms of its descriptive function. He describes things going on, I think, very well, very empirically. I do have a feeling that we could have a longer argument about the causes. And I'm not an expert about what's going on in Hungary or Kenya. I'm not even an argument about what's going on in America. Who is these days? But it does feel to me that both in his prepared remarks and in the way Norm is talking about it, while I agree with much of what's been said, it feels like we're looking at the wrong end of the sewage pipe in the sense that I think a lot of the problems that we have are way upstream of our political arrangements or even our political arguments. And while I agree with, I agreed to a limited extent with Yascha's three reasons, which were stagnating living standards, the breakdown of mono-ethnic societies, and the rise of social media. I'm not sure that I agree with the roles that you ascribe to them. First of all, living standards have been stagnating in certain pockets, in rolling parts of the economy, since the Industrial Revolution, if not before. Since 1700, you've seen whole industries destroyed, and yes, sometimes that, the Luddites, were a pretty populist movement. You've seen populist movements arise everywhere. And let me say for the record, before I start defending Trump voters a little bit, I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump, for those of you who don't know. I spent much of 2016 searching Amazon for deals on hemlock. I'm not a big believer in the argument that simply materialist explanations about stagnating wages and whatnot really explain all of that much, because even though the statistics don't capture things, the material prosperity of this country over the last 70 years has been remarkable. I think what is more important than the numbers about stagnation is the dislocations to settled communities. And so the core part of why I think you get populism and as a historical phenomenon and today is when you get the breakdown of civil society. Civil society basically serves as wetlands for our political ecosystem. If you have a well-ordered community where you feel like you have a place in the world, if you come from a stable family, if you come from a community where you feel like you're part of something larger than yourself and that you're wanted, historically you don't really look to Washington all that much to solve the problems in your life. Mary Eberstadt had a wonderful essay in the Weekly Standard not long ago about how you get the rise of identity politics, in large part coinciding with the breakdown of the traditional family. And I think one of the reasons that you get populism historically and in this moment is when you have a crisis of meaning, when people feel like they don't have a place in this world. And that was one of the most brilliant things that FDR did in the 1930s, where you had massive amounts of populism on the right and the left, to the extent those terms mean anything back then. And what FDR did was he appealed to the forgotten man, which is another one of these terms that Donald Trump had no idea where it came from, but he heard it and he adopted it. It is amazing how many terms Donald Trump hears, from New York Times interviewers and says, "Oh, America first, that sounds interesting," with a completely thumbless grasp of the historical connotations of any of these things. But what FDR, in the 1930s, there's a reason why you get fascism in Germany and Italy. These were and in the United States. These were among the last countries to industrialize. You had vast dislocations of settled rural communities, agricultural communities, where millions of dislocated young men were moving into big cities, rapid urbanization, rapid alienation, industrialization, and people felt caught out in the switches of industrial capitalism. And FDR, brilliantly, appealed to these people and said, no, the New Deal is where you got to be. Don't listen to Father Coughlin. Don't listen to Huey Long. And it worked. And over time, as Marty Lipset and other people would have pointed out, you had time for the urban ethnic communities to develop their own civil societies, where people once again felt like they were part of something. And so, which brings me to your point about social media. One of my favorite lines from Orwell is, "A man can feel himself a failure and take to drink and become all the more of a failure because he drinks." We have all sorts of problems in our society that cause people to retreat to social media and to virtual communities, and those problems get worse. And so one of the places where I disagree with you, to a certain extent, at least as you described it today, is when you talk about the sort of status, not to get all Richard Hofstadter, but the sort of status class anxiety of white ethnics when immigrants come in. And I agree that obviously there is some of that, and there's a pernicious amount of fever swamp racism on the right, which breaks my heart. But Robert Putnam is fairly persuasive that the breakdown in civil society you get from mass immigration and the diversification of communities is not grounded in racism or even the status class anxiety thing. It is the breakdown in civic institutions of trust, where it used to be when we lived in a society and you had a problem with your neighbor, you would adjudicate the problem between you and your neighbor. But when your neighbor doesn't speak the same language, doesn't go to the same church, where you don't have these interlocking understandings of social fabric, you tend to look to the state to sort of solve problems. And that is a problem across the country. There's I mean, you know the data better than I do. Immigration fuels populism in large parts of the world, I think for this reason, and it is not only racism. I think it can turn into racism when irresponsible politicians foment it into racism. We've seen a lot of that of late. But the simple fact is that it can have nothing to do with racism, and you could still see a breakdown of civic institutions. As Robert Putnam, a good liberal sociologist at Harvard, puts it, the more diverse a community gets, you tend to see people hunkering down and retreating from civil society. And where do they go? Well, they look to, if they can't find a sense of belonging in a real community, they look to virtual communities. And the problem with virtual communities is, to borrow a phrase from political science, they suck. And Facebook is awfully useful for staying in touch with old friends.
Like the Russians.
Like the Russians, yes. It is particularly pernicious when you go there to get confirmation bias, when you go there to have your feelings of resentment affirmed and confirmed by people you don't know, that you don't look in the eye, and who encourage you to get worse, not better. And I think that this is a huge problem, because at the end of the day, social media, sort of like mobs and crowds in general, as a pastor, a friend of mine puts it, populist crowds can't make you a bowl of soup when you have a bad day. They can't give you a hug. They can't help you out with the chores in your life or the stresses in your life. All they can do is write you, give him hell, Ann Coulter, or whatever. And that becomes a huge problem. The last point I would make, because, look, Lord knows I've got huge problems with what has been going on in my own camp. But let me say a couple words in defense of the forces that gave rise to Trump. And I'll say this, again, a caveat. Not a fan of Trump's, but Donald Trump is not Adolf Hitler. First of all, Adolf Hitler could have repealed Obamacare, which is actually an important point. If Donald Trump had Pat Buchanan's shrewdness and intelligence and strategic patience, he would be a far scarier person than he is. But he's got this lizard brain ego that only cares about flattery, and he wakes up in the morning deciding what kind of mess can I create today, and he's more like an escaped monkey from a cocaine study than a serious methodological despot. But at the same time, Joseph Schumpeter in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy makes this prediction about how capitalism will ultimately be doomed. And one of the arguments he makes, which I think has a lot of merit to it, and he makes it in 1946, is that the mass affluence of capitalism will create an adversary culture, which he calls the new class, which will, and he gets a lot of this from Nietzsche and the genealogy of morals, but he says that this new class will seek to undermine the values that capitalism depends upon. And the problem is that capitalism depends on a vast amount of stored social capital that it cannot create and cannot restore once lost. And so you have, I very much agree with what you had to say at the end about teaching civics and all the rest. On so many college campuses and in high schools, the only narrative that children and college students are taught in this country is a story of America, villainy, and oppression. Now, I'm entirely in favor of teaching the bad parts of American history. But can't we have a little room about teaching the good parts? And if you read Howard Zinn, which is one of People's History of the United States, is still one of the most widely used textbooks in high schools and universities in the country, he's very explicit about this. He says he's only speaking for the victims. And the story he has to tell is only a story of barbarism and cruelty by this country. If you teach generations and generations of people this, they might actually believe it. And when you combine it with a culture that comes from Hollywood and from the mainstream media that does belittle and mock the rest of the country that is not part of these coastal elites, that says their values are crap, that says that they're brimming with white privilege, right? Which has to be a shock to a lot of non-college educated truck drivers out there. It creates a vast amount of resentment. And we have an entire industry in this country that breeds this kind of resentment. And it shouldn't shock anybody if there's a backlash to it. The only populist movement I ever liked was the Tea Party movement. Why? because the Tea Party movement actually did, almost fulfilled the ancient libertarian prophecy of libertarians taking over this government and then suddenly leaving everybody alone, right? What they wanted to do was get back to basics of the Constitution, live within our means, all these kinds of things. I go to book groups for Tea Party groups, and they wanted to read Hayek and the Federalist Papers and all these kinds of things, and they were called racists anyway. They were vilified as racists nonstop by CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. And one of the arguments, I think, that reason why we got Trump is that this caused a major psychic break on the right, where you then get people like Michael Anton writing these Flight 93 election pieces of garbage, saying that if, we've already lost the idea of colorblindness, as he said to me in a debate. We've already lost this idea of sort of classical liberalism. Now we basically just have to choose between their identity politics or our identity politics. Or as I think he told Andrew Sullivan, do you want their despot or our despot? And this is incredibly poisonous. I'm totally with Yascha on the point that if I have to choose between liberalism and democracy, what has two thumbs and likes liberalism, it's this guy, right? Democracy is simply the doctrine that says 51% of the people get to pee in the cornflakes of 49% of the people. Liberalism says that individuals have rights. Liberalism says that we have that the government can't do certain things to us. Democracy doesn't say that at all. And so the last point I would make is that because civil society breaks down, because people are retreating to their homes to watch TV and be on Facebook, we are now setting up a system in our country where we are looking more and more to Washington to solve all of our problems because we don't know how to look closer to home. And the Democrats have sold a story about how the government can love you for a very long time, which I think is brilliant politically and incredibly pernicious substantively because the government can't love you. And now what we have is, because of this backlash, and because of the forces that gave rise to Trump, we have a similar argument being made from the right. And that leaves people like me who like to call themselves basically classical liberal or old Whig with being politically homeless. I'm ideologically grounded, but I'm politically homeless. And so I'm all in favor, well, I shouldn't say I'm all in favor of all your remedies. I think, Citizens United isn't the Medusa's head that you make it out to be in the book, but the real problems we have in this country seem to me way upstream of our politics, and that our politics are a reflection of those problems. And how you fix those is much harder. And we have people here at AEI trying to think about it, but ultimately, Max Weber said the defining spirit of our time was the disenchantment of the world, and I think the loss of religion and a sense of meaning that you get from close to home is the real source of these problems. And you should all cheer up because it's going to get worse. Thanks.
Yascha, do you want to respond to these?
Yeah, thank you for these really thoughtful and generous comments to both of you. I can't possibly respond to all of them, or I could, but then I would bore everybody stiff. So I'm just going to sort of make a couple of quick broad responses. The first is to norm, which is that I agree with you with the absolute importance of norms of behavior. It's both the ways in which the nature of a threat to our democracy at the moment is a complete breakdown of democratic norms, and the fact that even before that, some of the ways in which people felt like the political class isn't responding to them can perhaps best be understood as independent agencies and so on, not sticking within the norms that were supposed to govern. I do, though, want to push a little bit beyond that in a way that actually echoes how Jonah is pushing back to me, interestingly, which is that I think we need to go beyond the norms to understand what's truly going on. Because sort of at one level, the breakdown of the norms explains some of the ways in which our political system is dysfunctional at the moment. But that leads to the question of, well, why is it that those norms are now breaking down? And I think once you ask that question, you get to those deeper causes that are economic and around identity and so on and so forth, right? So why is it that as recently as 2008, in the closing days of a presidential campaign, John McCain at a town hall was able to do something very honorable, which is that somebody in the audience stood up and said, Barack Obama is an Arab and he's a dangerous man and I'm scared of what's going to happen to our country if he gets elected president. And John McCain said, look, it's really important that I win. I have deep disagreements with Barack Obama. I would make a much better president. But you know what? He's a decent man. He's an honorable man. And if he gets elected, you don't have to be scared for our country. Why is it that John McCain was able to do that in 2008? And there's no way that Donald Trump would do that. And it's not even clear to me that some of the people who might end up being the Democratic nominee in 2020 would do it either. I think that needs a much deeper sociological and so on explanation, and it has something to do with the loss of trust in politics and the political norms. And yes, some of the sort of rising ethnic tensions and so on as well. So that brings me to some of Jonah's points, which again I sort of broadly agree with actually. Not in every particular, but in the broad outline of them. I think you're absolutely right that sort of, there's the economic stagnation I talk about, there's the identity thing, there's the social media, but what that does cumulatively is a kind of cultural sociological break that is really important. I try to bring that out again and again in the book in different ways. I mean, one of those ways is to think about the intersection between culture and economics. Right? So I spoke to a politician who was very interesting and said, look, 25, 30 years ago, if I asked one of my voters, who are you? They might have said, I'm a steel worker, or I'm a foreman of a factory, or I'm, a union rep, whatever it is, right? And even if they're still doing okay economically, the culture in which they're embedded no longer gives them that same set of meaning. Perhaps they're an Uber driver now and they actually make the same amount of money, but if you're an Uber driver, you never, think about this, you never once have a repeat interaction with the same human being ever in your work life. And so when you ask that person now, who are you? They might say, I'm white and I don't like those immigrants coming in. Right? So it's a different kind of form that takes. And it's absolutely clear, as you're saying, that part of the geographic pattern of populism is that, there are many communities that are thriving, in which people have a lot of social interactions, in which they have a lot of hope that the future is going to be positive. And then there's a lot of communities where people are leaving and which are becoming more and more dysfunctional and where they feel like the economic future is going to be bad. And that's the parts of the country where people are really pissed off. There's something that I always think about, which is the sort of inadvertent result of American meritocracy in rural America. As long as you take 10, 20% of the population each year and send them off to remote colleges, but most of them come back or other people come to fill their place, that works really well. That's great. And that used to be the case as long as opportunity was reasonably equally distributed throughout the country. But now it's not. Opportunity is really unequally distributed. So what does it look like if you're in a town of 50,000 people that's a little remote? Well, what it looks like is that year after year after year, dare I say, an invisible hand swoops in, takes the top 10, 20% of 18-year-olds in your town, the people who would be religious leaders, civic leaders, economic leaders in that community, intellectual leaders, and takes them away never to return other than for Thanksgiving and Christmas. What does that do over time to a community? What does it do to its ability to sustain social connections and intellectual life, cultural life? It's really disastrous, and we haven't thought about how to deal with it. Now, the answer obviously is not to forbid this, but we haven't thought about what those implications actually are in a serious enough way. Two more points. I agree with you on Donald Trump. I mean, he resembles in his instincts every other populist leader around the world. The main things that populist leaders do that actually make a lot of them popular are to attack the independent institutions, to claim that there's a fight for the soul of the nation and that other people are trying to harm the nation, and it is to hand out presents to their loyal supporters. Trump does all of these things inchoately, but he does them in a confused, tactical way. He's not playing three-dimensional chess, he's playing zero-dimensional chess. So when you think of something...
Who knew there was chess?
Yeah.
Nobody.
So when you think of something like his attacks on Bob Mueller, he's incapable of doing what Orban is doing in Hungary and what Erdogan is doing in Turkey, which is to say, this is a fate for the soul and the nature of America. Instead, it's always obvious it's about him, right? So if there was a populist Olympiad, thankfully Donald Trump would not make medal rank. And given how much control he has actually consolidated over, for example, the Republican Party, it is absolutely scary to think about what would be happening right now if he were one of the medalists. And my fear for the future is not that Donald Trump destroys American democracy, is that he is the mold which will serve as the model for a more competent and smart populist who uses some of those tricks and tools. Last point, identity, which is a complicated issue, and I think, the project of building an equal multi-ethnic society has to be essential to everybody who wants this country to succeed. No matter which part of a demographic distribution you're in, no matter which side of a political spectrum you're in. I had a conversation on my podcast, which you should all listen to, The Good Fight, with Anand Giridharadas, who's an interesting writer and broadcaster who said, his parents are Indian immigrants, and he said, look, I sort of actually feel like I'm one of the winners. Over time, we're only going to have more power, right? I'm part of a demographic that's actually going to be taking over. But even if I think that, even if I don't think that people like Trump in the end are going to rule this country, I want to think about what the terms of a peace deal are. Because even if we end up winning narrowly each time, but we have 45% of a country who hate us and resent us, that's not the country I want to live in, and this is the only country I have. And I thought that was very smart and moving on that. So I think that there's three ways of relating America's historical injustices and all of those things to American principles. One is on parts of the right, and I wouldn't include you on that, for example, but parts of the right, which I think are overly glib about the challenge that historical injustice poses. And basically says, look, we have great principles, the American Constitution is absolutely right, and so on, and everything else we can just forget about. And I think that doesn't take seriously the ways in which there has been historical injustice in our country, and there is some ongoing historical injustice and racial injustice now. The second set of attitudes that I strongly reject is on the left, in parts of the left side of the political spectrum, where people say, yeah, you're going on about these principles, but you know what, they've never truly been realized. It's all hypocritical, so let's just get rid of them, right? And I think that is equally a mistake. I'm on the third side, which is to say, the principles are right. Like all principles in the world, they have never been fully realized, and our job is to try to realize them as fully as we possibly can. And that is a political project that I'm committed to, and I think in one way or another, everybody on the stage is committed to.
Thank you, Yascha. I want to turn to audience questions, but I want to make a quick comment, and I have one last question for you. So the comment, and I think we've gotten to this quite a bit. So in the book, you talk about stagnating standards of living more than you've done now, because I do think that the dislocation element is probably more important. The standard of living argument applies maybe to the U.S., though those statistics you can easily quibble with. It certainly doesn't apply to Poland and Hungary, right, which have grown pretty rapidly over the last 10 to 15 years. The dislocation argument does very strongly apply there, not because there's been immigration in Poland or Hungary, because obviously if you're an immigrant and you're inside the European Union, you're not going to live in Hungary. But
Budapest is a nice town.
Yeah, sure. But something like 20% of younger workers in Poland, and more recently, but certainly the last 5 to 7 years, people between say 20 and 40 have left Poland and Hungary. Right? It's very much like the small town America that you described, where the most ambitious people leave, never
the whole
to come back.
country of Bulgaria is like that small town.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so I think that narrative fits more countries better. It's a much more complicated thing to deal with, right? Because the only remedy to that tendency is to try and generate a more static society and limit the opportunities that people in certain places. It's very hard to deal with. So I'm a little less optimistic than you, I think, in how to deal with that situation. And then we get to the more prescriptive part of your book, and there, without being too glib about it, some of the policy prescriptions you made, I think you already believed in 15 years ago when you were an SPD member. Not all of them, but I do want to ask you. So because you come at this from the sort of center left, if you think of the sort of political project that European social democratic parties had 10 or 15 years ago, what do you think was missing there? What do you think is worth preserving? And importantly, why do you think those parties have completely crumbled over the last 10 years? I don't know if you've thought about this a lot, but I just want to see how you feel that they have evolved, should have evolved, or where you think they should evolve.
Yeah. Well, I think it's related to the question about the living standards, right? I mean, you're right that in Poland and Hungary, the living standards have improved over the last 25 years, obviously. But people were promised that they were going to have living standards like in Western Europe, and they're far away from that. There are many rural areas where people are doing fine, but they're not doing nearly as well as in the cities. And when we look at who really benefited, who really profited, who are the richest people in the country now, a lot of them are sort of, communist functionaries who managed to translate their political power into economic power very early on in the transition. And there's a tremendous amount of resentment, and understandable resentment about that. When you go a little bit further west to Western Europe, some of those countries actually have slightly better improvements of living standards than the United States as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? In Sweden, the average worker has experienced about a 40% improvement in living standards compared to 20 or 25 years ago. But I would defend the importance of that nevertheless, because it just seems to me that we've only known, in countries outside the United States, we've only really known democracy to be stable under quite exceptional circumstances. Think about the transformation in the life of the average European from 1950 to 1975. Some of them may not have had electricity in 1950. Most of them would not have had convenient central heating. They probably heated with wood stoves or with coal stoves, or they may not have had adequate heat at all. They certainly didn't own a car. Probably had very cramped quarters. Right? 25 years later, they had electricity and central heating and a one-family home and a car or two cars and a home entertainment system. Right? I mean, that is a radical transformation. Think of how quickly life expectation rose after World War II. Right? We're not going to be able to keep giving people that. And so it's a little depressing to think about, because I agree that we're just not going to be able to go do that. We're not going to be able to offer people 5% a year growth for the next 30 years, no matter what we do. Even if every policy proposal of AEI is implemented, that's not going to happen, right? But I think we have to take seriously the possibility that the kind of stability to which we're used was actually premised on that kind of growth. And that therefore politics is just always going to be a little bit more bitter and a little bit more chaotic going forward than it was in that time period. Now, where do I think social democratic parties went wrong? Well, I think social democratic parties lived for a very long time of the utopia of the universal welfare state that they were going to institute. That's when they really had pull, right? And yes, I'm broadly speaking on the center left, and I think that there was a noble ideal, and that created some very noble societies that, for all of their shortcomings, have some very attractive features. But once that welfare state was basically implemented, there was very little left for those parties to promise. And so you ended up with parties that basically just wanted to administer the status quo, which ironically for the United States has not yet realized that kind of welfare state. It was true of the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016 as well. The 2016 election was a choice between an extremist politics of change and a moderate politics of the status quo. And you might conclude from that Americans are all extremists who were very happy to vote for extremist policies. I personally conclude from that Americans really want to change. And that Hillary Clinton, despite her 274 policy proposals, didn't do a good enough job actually laying out a vision for what that would look like. That's true of European social democratic parties as well. They have no idea for what they actually want to do with power right now, other than perhaps increase minimum wage by 75 cents or something, right? And why should people keep voting for them if they can't actually credibly promise that things are going to get better? I mean, at least when Hillary Clinton said America is already great, it partially was a sort of affirmation of some American ideals. It also was sort of status quoist, but at least it had that element. European social democratic parties basically say everything's already great, we just don't want to change anything. We sort of want to go back to 1975, right? And so in terms of the remedies, some of them are perhaps broadly in line with what social democratic parties wanted 15 years ago. I think some of it is not. I take seriously, for example, the fact that was found by the Obama White House in a study that if we had the levels of equality in America today that we had in the post-war period, the average American voter would have a higher paycheck by about 20-25%. But if we had for the last 2 decades the level of productivity growth that America had from 1950 to 1970, the living standard would actually have been doubled. And so I'm all for equality, but I also think we have to think very hard about how to improve productivity in this country, for example. Another example I would give is housing, right? I think when you look at people's pre-tax incomes, they've stagnated for a lot of people in the middle. When you look at the post-tax incomes, they've slightly improved. When you look at disposable income, it is often either stagnated or in some areas really gone down rapidly, especially for young people who have a somewhat decent job, but they live in big urban centers. And why is that? Well, a lot of the reason is that they have to spend so much money on education, which we're still paying loans back for, and on housing. And there I find certainly European social democratic parties, and to some degree left-wing political movements in the United States, to be completely out of step with what we have to do. We have to try and build as many homes as possible so that people can actually access housing in the parts of the country where the economic opportunities lie. And there the political coalition is weird, because there are parts of the left that want that, and parts of the left that are too worried about the environment and so on and so forth to do that. And then there's parts of the right that want that, but there's also a lot of parts of the right that are actually much more concerned about stabilizing home prices because their constituency already owns homes, so they're worried about who else might come into their sort of local area, right? Yeah. So it's not clear to me where some of those economic preferences I have actually lie on the left-right spectrum.
Very good. Let's take some questions from the crowd. Please briefly say who you are and then ask a question. Let's go over here first. Please wait for the mic. That's a lot of instructions, sorry.
That's all right. I worked for the government for 30 years, so I can understand instructions. And in those 30 years, I worked for the Foreign Service. So one of the things I learned living overseas is the joys of looking at the United States and then appreciating the federal system. And we have 50 states, and Mr. Ornstein is worried that, everybody's going to move to 15 states and leave the rest with all the power without all the population and the rest. But what do you think of the possibility of a real renaissance of federalism when you have, like, California going all John C. Calhoun and ready to go its own way within the federal system? I mean, one of the great things in the United States, if I want to live a libertarian life, I can move to Wyoming or Alaska, or if I want to live in a socialist republic, I can move to Illinois, or if I want to live in an Al Capone republic, I can move to Chicago, which remains its traditional American way. So what is federalism going to have a renaissance because of these changing conditions?
Well, my view is that people like federalism when they don't control the federal government, but I'm happy that...
Well, when they control the federal government, they don't necessarily like it either, as we're seeing now with the attempt to force California back from its own emission standards. So it's...
No, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, they like federalism when they do not control the federal government. Yeah. Sorry.
Let me say that if I had to pick one magic wand solution to most of the problems that we've been talking about tonight, it would be federalism. Be pushing as much power and responsibility at the most local level possible for a whole bunch of reasons, which I can't get into all of it here. But even on the culture war issues, right? One of the advantages of pushing these questions down to the most local level possible is that the winners have to look the loser in the eye. They know who these people are. They actually have to have arguments. They have a sense of ownership of how they're going to live, and they have to engage with one another. all these forces that we're talking about, these nationalizing centrifugal forces that everybody retreating onto social media, basically create this tribal thing where you get political polarization and all that is downstream of all that, in my opinion. You know, my favorite New Yorker cartoon has two dogs sitting at a bar drinking martinis, and one dog says to the other dog, you know, it's not good enough that dogs succeed. Cats must also fail. Right? And that's where we are as a culture, where, I mean, you know this data better than I do, but 50 years ago, if I asked you whether you were a Republican or a Democrat, I would have to ask you a follow-up question to figure out whether you were a liberal or a conservative. Now, partisan affiliation is more predictive of attitudes and behavior than all sorts of things like gender and religion in certain cases. That's insane. And that's what you get when you start watching politics as an entertainment, and it's the entire country. And so this is one of my problems when you do comparisons to things like Sweden, which is a tiny country, and you have a continental country with 300 and X million people in it. The Founding Fathers never anticipated that all of this stuff would be handled by the central government. And getting to Norm's point earlier, they never dreamed that the branches of government would be terrified of exercising their constitutional authority. If you told Madison and Hamilton, you know, oh yeah, but you know, Congress isn't going to want to have any power. They're going to want to have the executive branch do anything. They would have thought you were high. But that's where we are now, because so many people run for office now because they want to be pundits. Because they're running to be the senator from Idaho who gets to be on Morning Joe or Fox and Friends. And I had on my podcast, not doing any plugging, but I had Ben Sass on the other day, and Sass was telling me that even when he would talk to Obama administration officials, he said, what is the thing that surprised you the most? And they would say that we just never really could figure out why all these senators would call us up and ask us to do something that we need for our state by executive order. And they would say, look, it's a 70% issue. It's hugely popular in your state. Why wouldn't you want, you know, credit for doing this? And the senators would say, well, you know, look, you're right, it's a 70% issue. But if I can get credit among the people I need to get credit from by nudging you guys to do it, the 30% won't be pissed at me. And so you have these institutions of government, and it's a similar problem with the courts. And if you just push all this stuff back down to the most local level possible, look, we fought a civil war, we've amended the Constitution, you can't have slavery, you can't have Jim Crow. But what I wrote a column right after Trump was elected, arguing that I was so happy that all these liberals were talking about secession and federalism and all these kinds of things, because what I wanted was buy-in. So the next time, you know, there's a liberal in power, maybe we won't get called neo-secessionists and racists when we talk about federalism, right? I want people to stick to one frickin' standard.
I'm pretty sure you will, no worries.
I know.
Let me make just a couple of reflections. One part of this is that there is hypocrisy that abounds all across this area.
Agreed.
And I would like to see the states become laboratories of democracy more than they have. I'd like to see the states allow the cities to become laboratories. But when you say, let's have a law where you can conceal carry in one state and you can conceal carry in all states, when you say, let's have health insurance across state lines, which means that states can't set their own standards for what insurance would be, when you say, we're going to set the national standards for emissions and we won't let states do what they want to do, that's not exactly adherence to the 10th Amendment. But the second part of it is, we live in a different world now, and we live in a world where large numbers of people live in one state and work in another. This entire area, my guess is this audience, is filled with large numbers of them who live in Maryland or Virginia and work in the district. That's true of people who live in Gary, Indiana and work in Chicago or work in Illinois. It's true all over the place. And it's also true that when it comes to things like disasters, the global economy and dealing with interstate commerce, that you're still going to have a much more robust federal government than we've had before. Now, it may be that we're going to have to find ways to enable it to work, and the tribalism makes that infinitely more difficult. And it also picks winners and losers now. You have disasters, and Texas is a winner and Puerto Rico is a loser. That's not a good way to have a federal government operate either. But it's a lot more complicated to deal with it now. And one final point, which is McKinsey had a study recently that said that I think by 2025, half of the people in this country are going to be a part of a gig economy. They are, or close to it. They're not going to be in traditional jobs where you get traditional benefits, where you're going to have a job for 20 or 30 or 40 years. It's that dislocation, I think, that has led as much to the changes in the economy as anything else. And that means people are going to be moving more as well. And figuring out a way to cope with that, which is very different from our traditional models of how we've had government interact with jobs, the economy, and voters, is another huge challenge, which would be there if you had a government that worked, much less one that doesn't.
Let me quickly get in on this as well. So as a newly mint American, I became a citizen a little over a year ago. I love talking about the Founding Fathers. And I love teaching to my undergrads Federalist 10, which is a great document. And, the solution to the problem that had, killed every republic in the history of mankind at the time that the Founding Fathers were writing, with the exception of the Republic of Venice that died duly 10 years later, was factionalism, right? And the solution was to have all these different states and to have this vast territory so that there would be as many factions as possible. Well, now we have two factions in this country. Despite all of our territory, we have Democrats and Republicans. And one of the most striking studies that show that, for example, is one where sociologists got a bunch of people in and had them say, look, these kids are applying for a fellowship, and you have to decide who gets them. And there were fictitious CVs that were manipulated in two ways. In one setup, some of them sort of had very white-sounding names and something, the president of a, high school Irish society or something. And, the other kid had a sort of traditionally black name and was the, president of a high school African-American society. And it turns out that people who are white slightly favored the white candidate and people who are black slightly favored the black candidate, but it didn't make much of a difference. Then we did another setup in which one of the candidates was a president of a high school Democrat club. And the other one was the president of a high school Republican club. And you know what happened? It was hugely predictive of who got the fellowships. Democrats hugely favored Democratic students, and Republicans hugely favored Republican students. That is a really striking fact, and I think we need to think about the implications of that in a serious way. Now, I think there's two ways in which unfortunately, federalism is not going to be the solution. Right? When I think about European misconceptions about America, which I know well because I used to have them, Europeans don't understand nearly the extent to which states already have political differences. They don't understand, for example, the degree to which, the welfare state in Mississippi looks completely different from the welfare state in Massachusetts. They don't understand that states write their own criminal laws. But they also don't understand the ways in which the political variation is not from state to state, it's within state. Right? I mean, the state of New York has very conservative pockets, and the state of Texas has Austin. And that's a real problem for some of us federalist solutions, right? Because sure, the amount of political heterogeneity goes down a little bit when you make a decision at the level of Texas rather than the level of the United States. But the culture war between Austin and parts of Houston on the one hand, and then a lot of the west of Texas, is basically as deep. So it doesn't completely solve those things.
I never claimed it solved them. It made it better.
It makes them a little better, but I'm skeptical about how much better it makes them. And the second thing to say is that obviously one of the big debates we have at the moment is immigration. And that's never going to be solved at the state level.
True. I think we, before they kick us out here, I think we can do one more question. Does that sound okay? Sorry, we're running a little over. So who wants to ask this last question?
This fantastic...
It has to be a really good
mic
question.
drop question.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. Clay, let's go over here. Wait for the mic.
Hey, Clay Fuller, AEI, Gene Kirkpatrick Fellow. Two really brief questions, actually.
One.
So, my alternate dissertation title was Why 435. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on expanding the House, and then in a broader stroke, I'm curious.
Can we just have yes and no answers to that? Yes.
Well, no, this is. I became a pundit because George Will called me an idiot. And my first op-ed ever...
This was last week.
Yeah, well, that's a different accusation of idiocy. Here at AEI, 25, 30 years ago, I was a young policy larval guy here, and I asked George Will, shouldn't we expand the size of Congress? And he says, that's the craziest, that's an idiotic idea. I can't imagine why anyone would do that. And I was filled with a blinding rage. And I wrote my first piece for the Wall Street Journal in 1992 on this very subject. I'm very much in favor of it. We can discuss more later.
Okay.
You're still an idiot. I am a deep skeptic, and just very briefly, the whole point of a Congress, which is different from a parliament, is in an extended republic, you bring people together face to face. They get to know each other. They debate and deliberate over a long period of time. They're able to put themselves in other people's shoes. They're able to understand that they're coming from a different place because they're coming from a different place.
That's happening a lot.
And organically, well, it isn't happening at this point, but that was the whole idea there. If you have 600, 700, or 1,000, you are going to move from what was originally one for every 30,000, one representative, what's now going to be one for every 800,000. Maybe you can move it down to 700,000 or thereabouts, but you're going to lose something. Now, what I would like to see is multi-member districts, bigger districts that are more heterogeneous, and that in Illinois for decades, the state legislature was picked with 3-member districts, and each voter could have 3 votes, 3 for one, 2 for one and 1 for another, or 1 for each of 3. You got a lot of candidates, really good ones. They knew they had to reach out to different kinds of voters to at least dilute some of the vote that others might get. And you had a better, more representative, more problem-solving legislature. The only thing keeping us from that is a 1967 law.
I think we should have an even number.
Oh, I already said yes.
But
I also agree with what Norm said. I mean, I think we should both increase the number of people in the House, and we should change the mode in which we elect them.
Okay. Well, I think that's it for today.
Oh, is that? Can I have a final?
Yes, but first I'm going to make an announcement about
Right.
you. Yascha is
Okay.
going to be signing books outside right after we're done. And if you like his final comment, I recommend you buy his book and have him sign it.
Well, now it's a lot of pressure.
I know,
to do it,
yeah. Your financial future depends on this answer.
Well, I just want to say that I sometimes, I've been going around the country and so on, and sometimes people come up to me afterwards and say that, they agree to varying degrees and so on, but I left them very depressed. So I'm trying to think about how to leave people less depressed. There you go. It can only,
Amazon Prime ships Hemlock.
So what I want to say is that I'm actually not depressed by this political moment. I'm scared by it. I'm sobered by it. But I'm also energized by it. Because while I can't promise you a happy end, I think that what happens does depend on what we all do collectively. We're still in a democracy. I went to a talk a few months ago by Amos Oz, the novelist, and he said, look, there's a huge fire raging out there in the world, and all we have is, a little glass of water. And it might feel hopeless for each of us to go and put the water on the fire, because that's not going to do much. But there's a bunch of people in the room, and there's a few people watching, and there's all of the people who you have influence over in your various professional and personal capacities. And if we all fight for our political values, and if we all take our glass of water and put it on the fire, then together we might be able to put it out. Now, if you agree with some of my analysis, you have some ideas about what you would do. If you agree with Jonas or Norm's analysis, then you have slightly different ideas about what to do. I think that's fine, right? What's important is that we recognize the responsibility we have, that we fight for our most basic political values, and use the freedoms that we still have.
Very good. Well, if you're not optimistic, I hope after that you're at least excited like a monkey who just escaped from a cocaine experiment. Thank you very much for coming.